you for watching this video. And many thanks also to the organizers of the International Conference on Media, Language and Society, Perspectives and Reflections on the Mediatization of Culture. Thank you very much. I will be presenting you my research on how violence in the Chilean Spring was dealt with in news stories from a polyphonic approach. Now, we know from literature that violence in the press is usually presented in a decontextualized way, and it is also distorted in terms of the levels of actually committed crimes and of covered crimes presented in the press, but also types of crimes presented and types of crimes actually committed. This is because the most violent crimes usually attract the public. Blood assures readership, but it does actually represent the majority of the kind of crimes that are actually committed in many countries, including Latin America and Chile. Now, this has a consequence, which is an increase in the fear and in feelings of insecurity among citizens, which ultimately leads to a change of conduct, because people end up avoiding certain parts of the city that they consider more dangerous, etc. Now, we also know from the literature that in social uprisings, protesters are usually criminalized, and state violence becomes a little bit more salient than usually. The media usually do not reveal state violence, but in extraordinary situations such as social uprisings, it does become a little bit more salient. Now, my research is focused on the social uprising that started in Chile in October 2019. It started due to a rise in the subway fare, which provoked attacks at certain subway stations of the capital, and the consequent reaction of the government, which declared many cities of the country in the state of emergency. We had curfews and military presence in the streets, etc. My research is also situated in the field of discourse analysis. It is a qualitative analysis, and I take a polyphonic approach. By polyphony, I mean the presence of several different voices and their discourses in a discourse, in press discourse in this case. So what I basically do is study voices and their discourses as well as their interrelations. Now, the question I posed is, how is discourse about violence presented in the frame of the Chilean Spring through the polyphony that is present in news stories of three widely read newspapers with a great impact on citizens? These three newspapers are El Mercurio, La Segunda, Las Últimas Noticias. All of them belong to the same company, and my corpus consists of 65 news stories. Now, there are certain polyphonic features which have an impact on the presentation of violence in my corpus. One of them has to do with the voices that are present, voices of participants, of people that are actually participating in the protests, including groups that are involved in urban violence. By urban violence, I mean the kind of violence we usually associate to riots, barricades and fires and destruction of public infrastructure, etc. However, these voices, these groups, are not incorporated in the press discourse so that they can defend themselves or present their points of view. On the contrary, they're usually presented in an aggressive way, like aggressive groups. Now, we also have voices of law representatives, such as lawyers and courts of justice, which are actually part of a typical crime story with a closure I detected in my corpus. This means that I had several stories in my corpus that follow the typical structure used in regular times, which means a crime or an act of violence, police investigation, which leads to the court of justice, arrest, court of justice, and possibly imprisonment. And we also have negative emotions associated to all kinds of violence, because as we will right now see, There are different types of violence present in my corpus. There are two major categories, two major types of violence: urban violence and state violence and protests. There are also some minor ones that are less frequent in my corpus. Now, as you can see, there's a huge difference between these two major types of violence. We have urban violence present in 49 stories, whereas state violence only in 19 stories. And there are certain topics associated to these two major types of violence. Now, in both types of violence, we have the structure I just told you about, which is a legal closure. This legal closure leaves us with a feeling of that law and order is restored or momentarily restored, and that the system, the legal system or the system in general, works. Now, regarding urban violence, some of the topics associated to it are financial loss in terms of loss due to the damages in subway stations, and as well as restaurants and bars and stores, shops that couldn't open due to curfew or violence. And then we have the topics of organization, allusions to organized crime, as well as attribution of urban violence to criminals. Now, these two topics, the allusion to organized crime and the attribution to criminals, could have an effect, could have the consequence of an increase in fear and of the feeling of insecurity of the citizens, and ultimately of citizens avoiding certain parts of the city, etc. Now, regarding state violence, we have a topic associated to it, which is the human rights violations. However, as you can see, it is only present in 3 stories, and this comes in contrast with the widely recognized injuries and ocular mutilations, etc., that have been detected during the social uprising in Chile. Now, as we have already said, there's a great difference in the coverage of urban versus state violence, as well as the aspects that are emphasized. For example, we have more emphasis on the financial loss and less on human rights violations. Now, we can also remark that all types of violence are condemned. They're all presented as something negative, associated to negative emotions. And in both types of violence, we saw it as a part of a structure with the legal closure that leaves us with this feeling of the system working and this feeling that law and order can prevail. Now, in contrast to other findings we can find in literature, in relevant literature, in my research, in my corpus, protesters are not criminalized. On the contrary, it is urban violence is attributed to criminals, which is a group that is in the margin of society. It's outside of the system. So we have the major type of violence attributed to groups that are outside of the system. Now, this might be due to the overwhelming amount of people that were protesting in Chile in 2019. So the press could not attribute, could not criminalize actually all the millions of people that were protesting. Now, we can also remark a tendency to deal with violence as if it were violence in ordinary times. Journalists in my corpus turn to violent crime, to this violent crime type of story, the traditional crime type of story, probably due to the common features they have, blood and destruction, etc. However, these common features do not explain the preference for urban instead of state violence, because state violence also presents features of blood and injuries, etc. So the answer might be in the political risk. What seems to make the difference is who is to blame for violence, who is presented as responsible for the violence. As we have seen, these are actually groups that are considered criminal groups outside of the system and in the margin of society. And a small remark, revisiting these conclusions and my findings 2 years after, we can see that it's exactly this kind of discourse about violence which I found in my corpus, It's exactly the same discourse used in the far-right candidate campaign for the presidential elections 2021 that recently took place in Chile. This means that the far-right candidate largely based his campaign on this kind of discourse about violence. Here you can have a look at the relevant bibliography, the references I used for my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.